Thank you. Thank you very much. We're not going to take questions now. We'll take them. We're not going to take questions now. Okay. And then afterwards we can. We can. Sorry?
I'm sorry?
Tishman's Fair, that we need to remind you.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I don't get it.
I think I mentioned something about Tishman's Fair.
Okay. We take the one question. The question is about Tishman Speyer.
Yeah, do you remember?
Whose name
That's right.
came up on the screen. Okay.
Do you remember this? This is the company that owns the MetLife building. The Chrysler building, right, where Cooper Union makes its money, it's actually not owned anymore by the Chrysler family. The Chrysler family has sold it many times. So not only does Tishman Speyer own MetLife, in 1997, Tishman Speyer ends up buying the Chrysler building. And you may know that Tishman Speyer is one of the largest real estate companies in the world. The founder is a man named Jerry Speyer, who's the chairman of the board of the Museum of Modern Art, by the way. And it turns out that Jerry buys the building in 1997, but then he holds on to it for only 10 years. So in 2008, 10 years later, the Chrysler building, Cooper Union's Chrysler building, is sold. And it is bought by the Abu Dhabi Investment Authority. So it turns out that when I work in Cooper Union today, my salary comes from the government of Abu Dhabi, and I wish I did not know this. So I'm sorry about that. That's the Tishman Speyer. I forgot to say it.
So, well, there are many, many things to talk about, but to set maybe some of the agendas of things that would be interesting. I'm sure that many of you are like me during the talk saying, okay, this part must be true, and saying, yes, this we know, and then this part is most probably not, and was there actually the whole archive, or was there just this one line of the archive? And I think one of the extraordinary things that immediately makes you think is the nature of performance, of what it is to be giving a lecture, but giving more than a lecture, in the way that the information there is both true and completely fictional. And the extraordinary way for me in the work that the fiction is what leads you to some sense of the strangeness of truth.
So I'm going to do this now.
Yes.
I'm sure sometimes in your work,
yes,
you think listening to the work, you think some things are true,
yes,
and some things are fictional.
Yes.
But nonetheless, you proceed. So how do you answer that question? I guess you just did briefly.
Well, I think one of the fortunate things about being in the world that we are in the arts, and it was one of the reasons I think that I became an artist and not an academic, was that in the field of academics, I realized when I was doing debating at school, or when I was having to write essays, if there wasn't a text that could be found, I was very happy to write it or to invent it. Or if there wasn't a quote that could be found, one would always, and you would always in debating, high school debating, you'd have to attribute it to Churchill. Yeah. As Churchill said, and that would be your point of authority. And I realized that in certain fields, if one wanted to be an academic historian, one would get rusticated and disgraced for any raw material, any archive which one altered in any way, as opposed to believing strongly that the work of people in the studio or making art or writing is to say there is raw material in the world to use, but there's also, it's there to be abused, misused, transformed, and shifted.
Yeah. But also it's interesting that, one would think that even in the academic world, they've produced enough concepts, rich concepts, to think that continuum between fiction and history, right? Fact and poetry, let's say, that they're not on opposite sides of the spectrum. And one of the concepts that was very important for me was maybe when I was doing the Atlas group was the one of trauma, right? This idea that you might live something but not experience it. And in that gap, there's something that emerges that's called the hysterical symptom. And it was interesting when reading the interpretation of dreams that when Freud describes this, the emergence of the hysterical symptom, and he talks about, let's say, the talking cure, what makes the symptom go away is not a story that actually conforms to what actually happened. He writes that it's actually a fiction. And it's not even a personal fiction. It's a cultural, collective fiction. And I found this to be a very interesting concept in thinking about trauma and as a way of thinking about photography itself, like as a way to escape this kind of referential, the indexical or the fabricated kind of dualism of the photograph.
I mean, for me, it's one of the points of connection, not so much with trauma, but with thinking about dreams. Where Freud explains that it doesn't really matter that you can't really remember your dreams, because as you're remembering your dream, in your act of remembering, in fact, you're constructing this story of what the dream might have been. You have tiny fragments, and you put these together, which he then calls the secondary revision. So when you tell someone a dream, it may well not be the actual dream you had, but the story of it that you've pulled into wakefulness as you come out of it, that you repeat to yourself, and that you then repeat ad nauseum to your therapist. And do. But the sense that there isn't a bedrock set of facts, and that's all that exists. It's always, what are the fragments of those facts? What are the fragments of the motor cars that can be found, from which one constructs a history of the Civil War?
Exactly. And for, like the horse races, in a way, this is what got it going for me. And these are historical photographs. You open a newspaper on Monday, and it was stunning that nobody asked the horse to be on time. Like, if you're betting on the horse, wouldn't you want to be certain that this horse won, not the one after it? And this idea of not being on time, I kept collecting these images, and in a way like you described here, if I couldn't find a document that encapsulated this idea of, well, how are you on time? How are you kind of present to the passage of the present if the moment in question involves extreme physical and psychological violence? You're always too early or too late. So if I couldn't find that document, then I had to create it. And for me, they felt the same, just like you're describing.
Now,
you need to create.
I mean, my memory, because I first saw work of the Atlas Group, and it was, I conflated two things together: the photographs of the winning distance of the horses from the time from the delay in the photograph, the anticipation in the photograph, and the car bomb engines. And in my head, I said, okay, when I was trying to remember it, I said, yes, I remember. One would predict, it was a kind of system of prediction, but I couldn't remember whether the position of the cars, the engines, would predict which horse had won, or whether which horse had won would predict which car was going to explode.
This is much better. I should make a new work.
No, but the point is that it's raw material which is then constructed into one's understanding. And I'm interested in this also as a way of thinking about history as this collage, as this. And I think what the work does so clearly is it shows it as a construction. It takes the raw facts to a point of absurdity where you understand that it's not simply, it can't simply be a mining of information that will give you a universal narrative.
And the collages, I think, maybe, I don't know if you use this, but for me, it also comes from, like, the titles. Better Be Watching the Clouds, Missing Lebanese Wars, My Neck. These are things I find.
Well,
I don't write them.
No, neither do I. I think the found text, yes, one either. I mean, I have a book called Words.
That's right.
And in it, there are different aphorisms or different lines. So there may be things from a series of proverbs by Solplaki, so we can go through different titles, like God's opinion is unknown.
That's right.
The pool ahead is not to be trusted.
Yeah.
My witness is in Europe, says the liar. A nicely built city never resists destruction.
We can trade books.
We can trade books.
Mine is called Fishing for Documents.
Okay.
And it's the same kind of, I pick them up usually from newspapers. And usually I read certain stories because, like, stories about Iran tend to be very rich with these things. Stories about India are always rich with, like, my neck is thinner than a hair. I remember particularly it came from a story in the Times.
But also it often happens in, it's an interesting one, about mistranslations, about the revelations in mistranslations. And in, this is obviously shown in language where you can have a mistranslation or a particular awkwardness. So, I mean, there was a translation from Chinese of the warnings on a fireworks to be the dangers of fireworks. And the warning was nonchalance can be tragic. And that's a phrase that we would never get to, but to understand.
But you never footnote them, right? Like it's not like you don't say, I found this here.
For me,
Right.
they're there. If people wanted, yes. I
Exactly.
make an overall caveat saying these are found texts. They are come from.
You will
if I
say
know
that.
from-
You'll say they
in a note,
came from there.
In a note, if people say where, so that people don't say, oh, you claim to have written them all yourself. I haven't.
But it would be
That's
interesting if you had to, if there's a request to footnote it, then one would have to footnote color or line. So that when you borrow a line, you might have to equally say, I'm sorry, this is not my line.
Yeah,
But it
so
came from this painting, and this color came from this sky.
One does,
this
one does.
photograph.
But there was an essay in which I'd made reference to Hegel talking about the history of Africa. And Hegel was famous for saying there was an important history of Africa during the Egyptian era, because of all the collection of Egyptian artifacts. But that after Egypt, world spirit leaves Africa never to return. And it's a very image of how Africa was seen. And in the essay, in the editor came back saying, please give the reference to this statement of Hegel. And it's a paraphrase of something I heard at university, but I said, okay, then he says, well, it's page 27 of the June 23rd Allgemeine Zeitung of Jena, page 12, which is so patently not, not a real thing. Or it might be, but it's not constructed.
You never know. The descriptions of the historians I used are also from quotes.
From different people.
He is 71, but for 7 years he was in prison and house arrest. I mean, I'm not that good to write this.
No, but there was interesting, for me, that one jumped out. I said, okay, that must be true. That must come from a source. There are odd idiosyncratic things that will be so hard to invent from nothing.
And these are in newspapers. Like, we're not talking books of poetry. Like, this is in a place that's supposed to be the most sober. And nonetheless, it has this water slid on his face, and he was afraid that his face will follow. Like, I'm reading about, like, this is supposed to be the most kind of sober historical fact, but it's full with these instances of just complete.
But, I mean, I think there are these moments of use of language, which is astonishing in moments of extremis, or that one comes across and finds. And in my case, very often it's trying to find the idiosyncratic and odd thing that in the Svetlana Alexeyevich book about the Soviet war in Afghanistan, there's a moment where, and they're all oral histories, it's all non-fiction, but there's a line in which she says, the young boy took a long time to die. And while he was dying, he looked around and just said the names of everything his eyes came across, like a child who's learning to speak. Tree, sky, bush, haversack. And it's kind of a devastating thing, but the fact that one has found it somewhere gives it a different authority from simply had written it oneself.
But then what do you do with the demand for, because that comes up, I'm sure, all the time, because you present your work in the country where it's linked, but also outside. And there's a demand for, I'm sorry, I don't have the details of this historical narrative. I need a chronological history. I need a geographic lesson. What do you do with this kind of request?
That demand? Well,
yeah.
Well, I think that I have a great belief in people's ability to construct a possible context. So when I saw the car bombs and the horse racing, I thought, I don't understand it. Of course, yes, of course, it must be that the one is used to predict the other. This is what Walid is making, and so you make it up. And very often when you don't have, it's like when someone's speaking and there's a bad connection and you miss a word, you put the word in. And so you're actively constructing a possible meaning of what it could be.
So when that request comes up, how do you address it?
Well, I address
do you go into...
No, so for example, when we did Ubu and the Truth Commission, which was based on evidence of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission here, and it had specific images that were images of a bomb being placed on a pig's head to test it out in a set of headphones and blowing it up. That people here would have known the story, but people in other countries wouldn't. Some people said, well, it'll make sense here, but it's never going to make sense in Germany. And in Germany, it said, oh, but here we've had the Stasi and the questions of police brutality from the Stasi. So it makes sense to us here, but it's not going to make sense anywhere else. And in fact, you found that in many, many places, there are enough common reference. So even if people didn't understand the exact detail, they maybe constructed different, their own version of the horse race story while putting those different pieces.
And that works?
I think that works. I mean, I'm curious at one level for you to remind me of the details of the Lebanese Civil War.
In 1920.
Starting from this and going all the way through. So it's not that there isn't an interest in different forms of narrative history which become the bedrock in a way for the extrapolations and inventions that go on beyond it.
But also I think, there's so many nuances to any personal story. Like in my case, it's also never just a story about Lebanon because my mother was Palestinian and my father's Lebanese, but she's Palestinian Christian. So when they moved or were forced to leave Palestine in 1947, the Palestinian Christians were given Lebanese citizenship because Lebanon needed to increase the number of Christians in the country. So she became Lebanese, but then my father worked for pretty much 20 years in Sierra Leone in Freetown. So the first, when we were growing up, my mother was with him in Freetown, but she would come to Beirut to give birth, and we would go back to Freetown. I only spent maybe 1 year in Freetown. But that history, it's clearly not just for me a history of Lebanon per se or Beirut. It's also a history of why would I end up in the United States in 1983, or why not go to Paris if I spoke better French than English. So there's so many different, the request is interesting, but it permits so many points of entry. And I think you had this diagram where, there's the past and there's the future. You're kind of at that cross-section of the projections as well as the backwards and forwards.
Should we talk a little bit about performance and about the activity, what it is to be on
stage? I have no
stage?
training in this.
No. It's not about training. You have no training, but but you have a huge amount of experience. It's clear. It was not a. It was a.
Do a presentation 15 times. You'll get.
It'll
work out.
But there's an accuracy in the remote that you have.
Did people see he did an interesting lecture at Harvard called the Norton Lectures. Some people saw it. Yeah, there's a section, it's very interesting, where he talks about the idea of what it means. You don't talk about the white shirt, but you work with the sleeve, and you're talking about the markers of certainty, like why you might use the finger. Or I have the clip. Do you want to see it? It's kind of interesting. Maybe we'll have. I didn't. Do we have a projector still?
I think we do, but.
Let me see where I put it.
This will be a bit embarrassing, but this is not planned.
I think I have to go to my dog first.
Okay.
I put you, I think, in foregoing stages, not props.
Stages, not props, okay.
Would that work?
That would work.
I think we have sound here. Sorry.
Oh,
you can go in the audience. I'll go
to stand to the side.
But there are other things that also happen in the gaps and spaces. Most importantly, the hesitation. The dramatic, the dramatic the uncertain, the pause before the certainty of the final statement, or mock uncertainty, the pause before the clarity of the final statement, or mock uncertainty hiding real uncertainty. And there is a series of accompanying gestures, unspoken, which are not there in the text, though in truth some of them are written down here in my notes, but which are an essential part of the performance of conversation or lecturing or talking. I mean, emphasizing this precise point, the raised finger. I mean, the circling finger, gathering consensus, whilst letting thoughts expand, gathering further examples. I mean, the adjustment of the sleeve, the removal of the watch. A small but important point being made here the circle of the thumb and forefinger.
This was pre-Trump.
I mean, there's the open-handed tapping of the podium. There's the collar tug. There's one hand in the pocket. There's the double-handed tossing of the salad. There's a davening, a leaning towards the notes. There's a shaking of dice for emphasis. And there's a demonstration of other possibilities with the windscreen wiper wrist. There's the apparent losing of one's place in the notes. The real losing of place in the notes. The open-handed, sincere simplicity. The weighing of the words in the open hand. The removal of the glasses for a frank look. The almost replacement of the glasses. The held gesture. A complex combination, touching the nose, touching the hair, the collar tug and the finger twirl to take us through a complex question. A separation of tangential action from thought. The more extreme the action, the purer the thought. Now, this catalogue of extraverbal explanation comes from...
We get that.
It ends here.
It
ends here. It's good, no? Huh? I loved when I saw it.
So, I mean,
I only saw it last week, and it was just like, wow, this is great.
But I mean, there is always the question. You have the initial belief that language should be tied to the world. Every word should correspond to something that is in the world. And I suppose those gestures are trying to show how often, in fact, language floats above the world, and you could have the same world with very different language and texts about it. And that there are all the things between the world which are the ways we try to convince people that there is a connection between the word and gesture is one.
But it expands. I think, in a way, what was interesting for me is when I did not go to art school because I needed a long-term visa in America. So when I finished photography, I decided maybe I should get a PhD. 7 years, 10 years, who knows? I'll have my visa. And it was interesting to attend a lot of academic lectures and then have artists come and present, because I felt the presentation was always the same. There was the podium,
Yep.
the glass of water.
Yep.
You're introduced badly or well by someone who invites you. Then they applause, you come up. You start to talk. There's usually slides.
A glitch. There's often a glitch.
There's always a technical glitch. You somehow say you keep going. You end your talk. If it's nice, then it's applause. Then you might say, okay, we have time for a question and answer period. Dead silence. 10 seconds later, some daring person raises their hand. They ask a good or bad question. You answer well or bad. It goes on. The person who invites you says, I'm sorry, we ran out of time. Thank you very much for Cohen. Everybody leaves. You stay on stage. People who didn't dare to ask you a question come up and congregate. You talk to them. The person who invites you comes and says, I'm sorry, we have to go to dinner. You go to dinner where the conversation continues. And it was incredible as a form. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if this became a form?
Well, I think it is. I mean, I think one of the occupational hazards of being a visual artist in the 21st century is, as you say, the expectation of the artist's talk.
To speak.
To speak. And I'm sure, as with you, at a certain point, if one's going to do this so often, it should become a kind of work in itself. So,
but you have in your talk, one of the talks, you say how, at the very end, you say, but I did not quote Derrida, I did not quote Foucault. And you were kind of giving a nice jab to that whole idea of the artist trained in the university and the kind of speak that we are encouraged. I mean, you go probably to art school today, I'm not sure if people mix pigments. You're given books to read. You're expected to probably talk about your work, whether it's personal, anecdotal, philosophical. Even the refusal to speak has become a caricature, right? I can't say anything, my work says it all. And you just sit there, like you can't even do this anymore. And it's interesting because I think it's probably linked to the training of the artist in the university.
I mean, I do think it was, for myself, I often feel it was a blessing that I was at an art school where there was no academic component. There was never an essay to write. One never wrote a word. There was never And it is difficult at art schools where you're often expected to write the essay before you do the work. And one of the things we try at the center is to have a space where you don't have to write the essay before you make the work, where you don't have to write a proposal, where you allow the things. But having said that, I'm sure you feel the same. It's a little bit as if we're in a play on stage here now.
Here?
You and me now,
Yeah,
trying to
wow.
remember our words. And I'm looking for them here, but I've brought the wrong notes.
That's right.
And they're not written down, and those that are written down are completely illegible.
I have more Jalal Toufi
It says
quotes
here-
I can show.
It says flowers and Pekingese,
Flowers
but I
and
think that
Pekingese.
means politicians.
Oh, yeah. I think that's funny.
And also the complicated way you get to arrive at a graphic image. I mean, some people like Damien Hirst or John Baldessari can take a photo and they can simply stick a yellow circle on it or a series of dots, and that's their artwork. But I love the complicated way of a whole archive being needed to arrive at a graphic image, which is a yellow dot on a photograph or a series of other dots.
This is in terms of the this did come from, the combination was a historical one. I did collect bullets, and I came across this, it's Jane's manual of the defense manual. This is the big
Bible.
reference book. And I was stunned to see that every manufacturing country has a distinct color code. And I went back to my bullets trying to trace where they originated. And then I produced the notebook as a...
But it's also an interesting, I find that, I don't really work much in color. And when I do work with color, it also has to be found color. And in your case, it was Jane's. I like different historical atlases. So you take the palette of a 1930s atlas, it's very different to an 1870s atlas. It's a whole different sensibility of, partly made by what pigments are available to the printing industry, but they're quite period. You can tell a 1930s color palette from a 1970s color palette.
Right.
The 1970s, it was Reader's Digest atlas that are very lurid and very bright. And then they've gone slightly more pastel again in the Times Atlas of the 1990s. But when you said that it was finding the colors on the bullets, that is a found color code.
It was, but you're bringing me also to Jalal, this historian, because in a way it's interesting now. I don't know why I never thought of it, but it's true. You don't work in color, or you work with a range of colors that are limited. But Jalal would, like this idea of the withdrawal of tradition can also affect color. So in a way, you might find yourself in a situation where you just have one color. So you make a monochrome, and of course, because people have seen monochromes, they assume you're working, with flatness or the canvas, and you say, or the artist might say something like, I wish I had blue. And then you might say, but look, there's blue, it exists in the world. And I might say something like, I know blue exists in the world, I'm unable to use it in my artwork because it's been withdrawn. And then you might say, well, maybe let's go check your eyes.
Yeah.
We need new glasses, maybe you're colorblind, and you turned out to be fine. And then I say, it must be psychological, let's send you to psychoanalysis, and you turned out to be fine. And only then you might realize that it's nothing with you. The world, color in the world has withdrawn, leaving you with one color. You wish you had another, you just don't use it. And the same can happen with line. You can make a canvas and just put straight line. And then you wish you had a curve, and people will show you curves. And you say, I'm so envious that you're able to use it. In my artwork, I cannot access that curve. I need to resurrect all of the history of line to be able to use a curve again. And it's a very strange feeling when my work shrank, it literally shrank for me as an artist. So you don't do an artwork because you want to be correct. You do an artwork because sometimes you want to be wrong. Like you want someone to come and tell you, have you heard of this guy named Duchamp? He shrunk his work. Maybe you're just a bad copy of Duchamp. Like you want somebody to tell you it's a conventional gesture. Yeah. That you're just copying someone bad.
But there is something interesting about change of scale, radical change of scale. So when we do theater projects, we work with a miniature model that's maybe that size, that stands in for the theater that's going to be 10 meters high and 17 meters wide. And then at a certain point, you get to love the model, the scale. And when you see the huge final thing, you think, oh, this is like a a blow-up of a model, and the real size, the correct size, is the model. And you think, well, you've done this entire, really complicated 80-person orchestra, this whole opera, to justify this model that is that size.
That's right.
And it shifts. Obviously, sometimes the model is, when you see the file, oh, thank God we're not with the model, with the real thing.
After having done the shrunk work, then I could do the exhibition in Beirut, because only then I could feel, oh, I'm in the model now.
Yeah.
Prior to that, it was just impossible.
And I presume, I don't know if it was done, but the sense of putting a cell phone through a model, through the camera of that, where suddenly a model that size, the walls are the full scale, is actually a very good way of anticipating.
And there's multiple symptoms. I think the shrinking, then not only the shrinking, I went to the Louvre because I thought these objects will shift. And they did shift. And the sad thing is Gary, Nouvel have no idea that they're building museums for objects that will look very different. And this should be an opportunity for an architect. Like, what a great opportunity. You build a kind of museum expecting a certain kind of object.
And different things around.
Something else is going to show up. Then you have to build a new wall. You have to build a new light. You have to build a new pedestal. You have to build a new label. But they're so insensitive that I don't think they deserve these occasions. And that's the sad thing about it.
But it's very interesting the way an artwork changes. So when artworks in Paris were taken from the museum, artworks were taken out of the Louvre. African sculptures had a house in the Louvre, in a room in the Louvre, and they were taken to Quai Branly, to the new museum of art that's not from Europe, and objects that are not from Europe. And the argument was very much that in the Louvre, work like that was completely aestheticized. It was there as a beautiful object, but it lost all its meaning as a ritual object and all that context. In Quai Branly, it would regain that. But of course, it then lost its status of being some of the great artworks made in the world. It was taken, and so it always seemed to me that the object did change between what it was in the Louvre and what it was in Quai Branly. In other cities, workers moved from museums of ethnographic museums to art museums because they're saying we shouldn't just understand this as a colonial curio. It's one of the great manifestations of human art making, so should we see that? And so it's always seemed to me that, in fact, the most accurate understanding of the work is in its crate, in transit between these two different places where its indeterminacy is inescapable.
Yeah.
Or else it has to be like...
That's funny, because I
like
made a whole
Schrodinger's,
video.
Is it Schrodinger's cat?
That's right,
It's
you don't
in
know
both
what's
places, it's both in the crate and not in the crate.
The video I made that accompanies this work is actually of the transport of the objects in the tunnels in the Louvre. And it's a 6-minute video of the objects in the crates going from one place to another. And I tell the story of this is when the objects are trading faces, and what better place than France to do it? Because France invented camouflage. They did the first face transplant. What a wonderful place to trade faces. So it was perfect for that like moment. And you're right, it's the crate.
Yeah, the different things. I think that we've got, we'll do, okay, well, let's do it now. Okay, we've got time for 3 questions. Yes, Mikhail.
Maybe we can get more lights. Is that
Can we
possible?
pull the light up and the audience light? Can we push
can
all the
turn-
lights up a bit? Yeah. We're going to take just 3 questions. So, Mikhail, you had a question, and there's a, yes. Let's start with you, Mikhail, and then we'll go to the back.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Walid, I wanted to ask you about humor. And I think actually it's an interesting question with William next to you on the stage. Because, and I don't know if it's just the mood I'm in this evening, but what you showed us was so sad to me. And I kind of course, we all know that humor is both a defense and it's also an easier way of talking about serious things. You know, the court clown was the only one who could speak truth to the king. But where does it come from with you? Is it something to do with your background and having moved around a lot that you kind of need to tell us this fantastical story in this humorous way to deal with the very personal pain of what you're showing us? Or is it something more than that? I hope that makes sense.
I'm putting my face on my hand on my face because I don't like to be photographed. I'm sorry.
That's right.
I'm extremely photophobic. I hope you do not take pictures. It just
Okay.
feels very tough. I haven't thought that much about it, and I can't tell what the proper word is. Maybe you can help, whether it's wit or humor. But I think it's maybe the one thing that seems equally strange to me is that crying would be the more natural response. That seems equally fraught. Like, why should one cry and that not be, in question? And humor is kind of in question. I know that my natural response to usual work that I respond to immediately is to just go, ha! Like if I see something and I have this kind of laughter, then I know there's something there that I hadn't thought of, or it just speaks somehow to me. So, but I haven't really conceptualized the precision of what's the difference between humor and wit and laughter. Have you?
No, but I think that the moment of surprise that is always the basis of an expectation that isn't satisfied and something else comes in its place is the surprise we get in our synapses that makes us laugh, that response to which is laughter. So yes, there is laughter, but it's always a sign of or in this case, it's a sign of a connection, a new connection, possible connection, which makes you aware of what you've been doing in making sense of it, of realizing, oh, I've been taken in by this. No, I'm sure he's talking complete rubbish. None of this happened. It's all invented. Even the archive he's put up on the screen, that he's invented in this moment as it's being, or it must have invented an hour ago because the slide comes up. So I think that the humor both pulls you into yourself, you become aware of what it is to be laughing.
Maybe it's the opening into the doubleness or the tripleness or the irony of every statement, so it kind of like triggers everything, and one of them responds to you.
And I think it is also a belief, I mean, maybe it's giving that to you, but a sense of the absurd as a real way of making sense of the world. In other words, it's not an aberration at the edge, it's not a joke about the world, but these crazy dislocations are what we're constantly trying to bring together as if there was a coherent, as if there was an easy understanding of the civil war in Beirut. I mean, one just thinks, in South Africa, we're so full of absurdities, of connections. So if one had to take the history of the Apartheid Museum and the Kroc brothers and skin lightening cream and getting the permission from the gambling license authority for the history of South Africa to be made, it's no stranger than the most outlandish betting on horses by the time of difference between them or where car bombs come. So those kinds of connections, I think, ring true very here. Let's go to the
I like also the Jalal quote. Like, he literally was afraid of laughing because he thought he would die from it. And that was so kind of, I thought that was very interesting.
Yes.
Hi, great discussion, by the way. I just wanted to could I have your response to this following idea? So now, I'm seeing a narrative making its way through your this whole talk. Like, it seems like specifically this idea of the archive, what the archive can do. The first part being, here you have protesters, the hidden knowledge, hidden archive, bringing it through, and then that in its sense, using the hidden and using that to speak to power. Then I'm seeing the academics making a bet, almost like seeing where they're supposed to be at the horse races. Everyone is expecting, the expectation is to whoever comes first. But here you have these academics making a bet in a different way, seeing the world in a different way. And then that is another way, the other function of the archive. And then there's the third function, the function of the car engines, using that to actually push the power's agenda, because it's a crime scene. So in a sense, that's part of the journalist seeing the cars and taking pictures of those cars. It's part of that game of trying to catch the criminal, the power trying to assert its power. And then you have your bullets. So I'm still trying to pick in terms of actually the image of the bullets, seeing where power has actually made its mark, ironically made its mark with the bullets, but you have this one area, yet you have all these different countries, different states having their impact within that space. And then the final part, which for me was like almost a culmination of everything. It's like, in the end, it's almost like the function of knowledge is to not necessarily see what we know, but rather to see what we do not know. And so now I ask you then, what is, in terms of doing this archive work, in terms of bringing these stories, is your archive that you're presenting to us? I mean, are we speaking to power? Are we speaking for power? Because I'm seeing a very range of positionality in terms of you versus power, but how do you see yourself in terms of that power? How would you like us to see you in terms of that power? Does this question even matter?
Oddly enough, archive has not been also a term I've worked quite a bit on. I don't make a difference usually between images I make or ones I find. They're on a continuum. But the relationship to, I mean, there's one relationship to, let's say, the hidden in the Atlas group. For me, there's another one with scratching. And in fact, it was the model of trauma as a way to think about violence was so limited for me with the Atlas group that it felt I had to abandon that. Because Jalal had showed me that there is more than this difference between the lived and the experience. Sometimes it's not you. Sometimes this certain violence affects the world, and you might be there to register that. So you think it's in your head. If the work shrinks, you think you need new glasses, you think you need therapy, but it's no, and you should probably think the first and the second, and in 99% of the cases it is, but sometimes you confront a situation in which the world is affected. I'm not answering your question about power, but in relation to power, I feel it's also a term I've constantly not been interested in necessarily in art, and I've done it elsewhere either, and I failed miserably and continuously. And so I'm constantly confronted, like I'm just not a good activist, I'm not a good political organizer. At Cooper Union, you see what happened. Like the students changed the entire structure, brought a new president, and then nope, it's going to take us another 25 years because I'm sorry, we're still in a neoliberal order that dictates the way we move. The way that translates into the artwork, I find one has to be very sensitive of the different rhythms. As soon as you think they're the same, this kind of geopolitics, political economy, and the kinds of facts you encounter in an artwork, that's when my sense is you do damage to yourself and to the artwork and to the world. Like I'm so careful not to confuse those two. That doesn't mean I don't participate in both, but I'm just always careful of there's a different rhythm, frictions, lines, volumes, thrusts in here in the studio that's fundamentally different from the one that I do in the Gulf, in Lebanon, as an activist, or in Cooper Union. So the relationship to power in the artwork is always fraught to me or unsettled. I don't know. How do you feel about that question?
I mean, I'm interested in the two thoughts as you were answering that. The one has to do with the archive, that this is a kind of utopian archive. Real archives are very often about hiding information and keeping information from people. They say, we store all information, but with a lot of archives, it's very difficult to ever get to that information. Right. So this is a kind of an archive which is accessible, riotous, and what would it be if all information was there available to us? So it's
But what I had not known when I was doing the car engine, I wish I had been present to this. The fact that I could go to an archive and ask them to see pictures of engines, and the mere fact that they would give them to me should have been signal enough to me that something had transformed. Yeah. Namely, that those images no longer held any juridical value. Yeah. These images were no longer going to be used to catch the people responsible. Now it has become a commodity like any other to be traded, mapped, and organized. So all I had to do is give me all Benzes. They would give me all Benzes. That's why I had to stop the Atlas group, because it was participating in this logic that today I think has become an algorithm. Algorithms do the Atlas group better. Yeah. So we should stop. We should stop work on maps. We should stop work on archives. Just let the algorithm do it. They're much more sophisticated than any artist will ever be on this. Sorry.
And we have one last question. if there is a last question. Yes?
Are words and pictures and film changing anything in the world? Do you think what you guys do is making a difference? Do you think it's poetic? Do you think like it's actually making a difference in people's lives?
So the question was whether photos, artistic activities, I'm checking if this is the right question, if they do make an impact or change people, affect and change people's lives.
Yeah.
I can give a short answer, but I think it's more interesting what you say.
Your question has an implication. I get a sense that you're feeling that they don't. Is that true? Or I have a feeling that your question implies that they don't.
No.
Am I wrong?
No, that's it. Okay.
I'm asking because, maybe I'm asking for advice how, because I'm a writer, so I'm in advertising, so I want to do adverts that actually make a difference. And I don't just want to sell products. I just want to.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I mean?
Yeah.
I want to write beautiful things.
I think it's the question about power. It links to that question, maybe, in the sense of, what I found myself doing is when I function, when I function as an activist, when I want to change policy, attitudes, the language used to describe certain, then I have to function very differently than when I do as an artist. And I rarely find it easy to work on that continuum. I usually find I have to be very clear about the difference. And when I want to change the world or change the treatment of workers in Abu Dhabi who are building the Abu Dhabi Guggenheim, then a whole different set of strategies would have to be deployed than the ones I would deploy in the studio. And in the studio, usually, and Jalal always says this, he would say, are you saying this? Who are you saying this? Like, who does one make an artwork? And he says, only to oneself, only then is there a real dialogue. And I kind of fundamentally believe that's to be true. Because he has this thing about an artist is at the juncture of absolute aloneness, which is not to be confused with sociological solitude, and collaboration, which is not to be confused with an active working together. You collaborate with others in the studio in the sense that it's an untimely collaboration. And you're lucky if some of the experiences you have in the studio, someone might come and confirm that they too are experiencing them. And you're luckier if they're alive as opposed to someone in the future or in the distant past. Most of the time they are yet to come or they've died a long time ago.
Yeah, see, I partly agree and I partly disagree. I think just if one thinks of one's own formation, how important different books you've read at a particular time, films you've seen at a different time, stories you've heard, how these, it's not that you suddenly learn a new thing when you see this film, but it confirms one element of yourself that you want to work towards or that you feel comforted by or affirmed by. And I think that, for me, that is the way in which the work that you do or the work that any artist here does operates in the world. And
you mean
also,
the twinning kind of thing?
No, not the twinning, that one recognizes oneself in something that one recognizes in the work. Understanding that the work is coming towards you and you're always going out towards the work. That when you see the horse racing photos, you're also thinking of the Star newspaper and Thomas Aquinas writing in in the Mail and Guardian of the horse racing tips, and other things. There are all those other associations, which is how we bind ourselves to the world. But more than that, there's a sense of commonality of everybody listening to your lecture here in the room, and moments of laughter that bring people to say we're understanding it together. And there is a sense of solidarity, of finding connection with other people through the different views, as it were, meeting on the piece and going back. And I understand that is different for lobbying directly for the changing of wages of workers in Abu Dhabi. And I understand that you have to do it for yourself in the hope that somebody else is going to recognize it. But I think that that is still a vital part of how we are in the world. So that while we may feel radically alone, there is still a sense of companionship around us. But I think it's been a long and fantastic talk from you. Many things I'd never seen or heard before. And as with all showings of artist work, the great thing for me is that if only I'd thought of that, I could have done that. And also writing down a few words which will go into the book of words to be reused and recycled in a different archive.
Thanks.
So I would thank you very much, and I'd thank everybody for